Hi guys. Tonight we walk into the Mississippi cotton country of 1850, where the morning begins in darkness and the day seems to stretch without mercy. What does it feel like to open your eyes before dawn? Already tired? Already listening for footsteps outside? Already knowing the fields are waiting? What does endless work really mean when your body is counted like a tool and your time is not your own? So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and while you're here, comment below with your location and your local time. Now, dim the lights and you find yourself in the flat. Damp world of the Mississippi Delta, where the air hangs heavy even before sunrise, and the land seems to breathe mist from every ditch, riverbank, and cotton row. You wake on a pallet that does little to soften the hard planks beneath you. The room is close and stale. Ash from last night's fire still lingers in the air, mixed with damp wood, old fabric, and the faint sourness of sweat that never truly leaves the cabin. It is not quiet. Not really. Someone shifts in sleep. A baby makes a soft sound. Outside, a mule stamps the ground. Somewhere in the dark, a rooster tries to announce the morning as if he is in charge of anything at all. You do not rise because you feel rested. You rise because the day has claimed you already. In Mississippi in 1850, cotton is king, as people like to say with grotesque pride. The state is one of the great engines of the cotton economy, producing enormous wealth for white planters and merchants, while enslaved black Americans create that wealth with their bodies, hour by hour. The expansion's fairly recent and shockingly fast. Land seized from native peoples has been turned into plantations. New fortunes are made in muddy districts that only a few decades earlier had been forests and swamps. To planters, this looks like progress. To you, it looks like another place where suffering has been arranged with businesslike care. The first sensation of the morning is often touch. Bare feet meet cool dirt or rough floorboards. The hem of a coarse garment brushes your legs. The air has that strange chill that comes just before the heat takes over. Your clothes are simple and worn. Fabric scratches at the skin. Shoes, if you have them, are stiff or broken. Many plantation owners issue clothing only once or twice a year, and the garments are meant for durability, not comfort. Comfort would suggest concern. That would be a little too generous for the business model. You move quickly because slowness invites attention, and attention can be dangerous. A small fire may be coaxed back to life if there is time. The smell of smoke thickens. Someone swallows a mouthful of cold cornmeal mush left from the day before, or gnaws at a crust if one can be spared. Breakfast is not a grand event. It is fuel, and often not enough of it. Pork, cornmeal, molasses, sometimes sweet potatoes, the same staples, again and again, enough to keep labour going, rarely enough to satisfy. You step outside and the plantation begins to reveal itself in the dim light. Cabins stand in rows, often set apart from the planter's house, which sits at a distance with its own sense of importance. The big house may have painted walls, glass windows, and shaded porches. The quarters are usually small, crowded, and roughly built, logs or planks. Mud chinking, dirt yards, few cooking pots, a broom of twigs, a broken stool repaired 3 times because there is no choice. The difference between these spaces is the whole logic of plantation life made visible in wood and clay. The sky starts to pale. Mist lies over the ground in low sheets. Mosquitoes still hum near the wet places. The river country does not smell clean and fresh in the pretty storybook way. It smells rich, muddy, green, and rotting all at once. Wet leaves, standing water, animal manure, smoke, earth opened by hose. Cotton itself has a drier, a dusty scent later in the season. But morning belongs to the damp ground and the old river breath of the delta. Then comes the summons. Sometimes it is a horn, sometimes a bell, Sometimes a voice, whatever form it takes, it means the same thing. Move. You join others gathering in the half-light, forming lines or drifting toward the fields under watch. Some carry tools. Hoes are common. Sacks come later for picking season. But cotton labour is not only harvest. In 1850, the cycle of work is constant. Land must be cleared, furrows opened or seeds planted, weeds cut away, pests watched for, plants thinned, rows maintained, and bolls finally picked, weighed, and hauled. Cotton demands time the way fire demands wood. It is always asking for more. A mainstream fact that shaped these days is painfully simple. On many plantations, enslaved workers in the fields laboured from first light until dark, especially during the most demanding parts of the agricultural year. The exact hours shifted with the season, but the principle did not. Your day belongs to the crop belongs to the planter. Therefore, by their cruel arithmetic, so do you. You walk to the fields as dawn spreads slowly over the land. The horizon is low and wide. Trees mark the edges of bayous and streams. The soil, dark and fertile, is the sort planters praised in letters and account books. They admired the earth with real affection. They praised it constantly. They didn't extend the same tenderness to the people forced to work it. Funny how selective the human heart can be when profit is involved. As the sun rises, shapes sharpen. Rows of cotton stretch ahead in long lines that seem to deny the idea of finishing. During hoeing time, you bend and strike, again and again. Hands harden, shoulders burn. The back begins complaining very early, but complaints are a private luxury. The soundscape of the field settle around you, metal scraping soil, stalks brushing cloth, feet dragging through furrows, insects droning, an overseer's horse snorting nearby. Human voices are cautious, often brief, because talk can be read as idleness. The overseer is part manager, part threat, part daily weather system. His presence changes everything. He watches pace, posture, output, and mood. Plantation records from the period discuss labour in cold, numerical terms. How many acres hoed, how many pounds picked, how many hands available. The language flattens people into units, yet on the ground, the system depends on intimate pressure. Someone is always expected to be measuring your body against a standard that ignores fatigue, illness, pregnancy, grief, or pain. Historians still argue over some details of daily rhythm from plantation to plantation, because no two estates were identical, and records often reflect the planter's self-image rather than the lived truth of the enslaved. Some owners claimed they were moderate. Some insisted their workers were content, which is the kind of statement that tells you more about their conscience than reality. Testimonies from formerly enslaved people, recorded later, reveal long days, harsh discipline, and constant insecurity far more clearly than planter diaries ever do. By early morning, the damp coolness is gone. Mississippi heat does not arrive politely. It settles on your skin and stays there. Sweat gathers at the base of the neck, along the spine, under the arms. Cotton clothing clings. Dust sticks to the ankles. The sun lifts higher and light flashes off leaves and open ground until your eyes narrow on instinct. Drinking water may be brought to the field, often warm by the time it reaches you. You take what you can get. There are small patterns inside the labour. You learn how to shift your grip on a hoe to save the palms. You learn the posture that hurts slightly less, which is not the same as not hurting. You learn how to judge the overseer's distance by the sounds of horse hooves or silence. You learn how to exchange a glance that says everything without inviting notice. Plantation life teaches observation with cruel efficiency. A quirky detail from the cotton world is that some planters became oddly obsessive about seed varieties and row spacing. Speaking of cotton plants with the same fussy seriousness, Modern people reserve for artisanal coffee or expensive houseplants. They debated soil conditions, rainfall, and cultivation methods while relying on forced labour to carry out the entire experiment. There is something chilling in that contrast. Agricultural vanity on one side, human exhaustion on the other. As the morning stretches on, hunger starts returning. The body burns through its thin breakfast quickly. The smell of crushed greenery rises from the rows. Gnats circle your face. Hands grow slick, then rough again as dust settles into sweat. A hat, if you have one, helps little. The neck burns anyway. The hours do not move in a neat line, and they pool and drag. A minute feels long, then somehow the morning is gone. Midday may bring a short break. May. That is the important word. On some plantations there is time to eat in the field. On others the pause is brief and tense. Cornbread, bacon, peas, maybe a cold sweet potato. You chew fast. Rest is never deep because the body knows it must rise again almost immediately. Shade becomes precious. A tree at the edge of a field can look like a palace. You notice people in different states of strain. An older man working with controlled, economical motions. A young woman carrying herself with determination that barely conceals fatigue. A child sent on errands or lighter labour, though lighter is a flexible term when measured against a child's frame. Enslaved children were often drawn into work early, beginning with tasks like carrying water, scaring birds, minding younger children, or gathering wood. By adolescence, many were doing substantial field labour. Childhood exists, but in fragments, briefly, under pressure. There is no single plantation experience, and that matters. Mississippi had small slaveholders and giant planters. Some enslaved people worked in gangs in the fields. Others laboured as drivers, artisans, cooks, laundresses, blacksmiths, carpenters, nurses, or domestics. Yet cotton plantations depended above all on field labour, and field labour meant repetition on a scale that could flatten the spirit if the spirit were not stubborn. And it was stubborn, even here, especially here. Life is more than labour statistics. Someone hums under their breath. Someone tells a joke so dry it barely looks like a joke until a corner of a mouth lifts. Someone saves a seed, a scrap, a thought, a name. Family bonds persist despite sale, threat, and intrusion. Spiritual life persists. Memory persists. Language, gesture, cooking knowledge, herbal remedies, songs, and private meanings move from person to person in ways the plantation system cannot fully map. That is one of the system's failures. It can dominate time. It can steal wages, safety, children, and rest. It still cannot completely own the inner room of a human being. By afternoon, the heat has turned heavy and punishing. The field shimmers. Insects seem louder. Muscles begin to tremble in small, hidden ways. This is often the hardest part of the day, when the morning's endurance has been spent but evening remains far away. The pace is still expected. The row is still there. The overseer still watches. This is where endless work days become more than a phrase. They become a bodily fact. Time enters the shoulders. Time enters the knees. Time enters the lower back and stays. There are also moments of uncertainty built into plantation life that no amount of labour could solve. Would a person be sold? Would a family remain together? Would illness be ignored until it became deadly? Would punishment come for speaking, slowing, breaking a tool, resisting, grieving too visibly, or for no clear reason at all? Fear itself is labour. It drains energy before a hand even touches the hoe. Late afternoon has its own atmosphere. The light shifts from white glare to a thicker gold. Long shadows begin to form between the rows. The temperature eases only slightly. Shirts are stiff with salt. Dust settles on skin in fine layers. The smell of the fields changes as the heat breaks a little. less sharp now, more earthy again. You keep moving because stopping has consequences. At last, the end of the field day approaches. Not freedom, only a change of duties. The return from the rows can feel strange, almost unreal, because the body is still braced for command. Feet drag back along paths worn hard by repetition. Tools are carried in aching hands. The sky glows over the plantation buildings. Smoke starts rising from cabins as fires are lit for evening food. The smell of cornmeal and wood smoke spreads through the quarters, mixing with tired voices and the rustle of people trying to reclaim some small corner of the night. This is the rhythm of a day in cotton country. Rise before dawn, labour under watch, endure heat, hunger, and pressure. Return after sunset to do what still must be done. Cook, mend, wash, comfort children, tend the sick, pray, whisper. Fall into sleep not because peace has arrived, but because the body has reached its limit. And then morning waits. The cabin holds the last of the night like a clay jar holds warmth, but not for long. By the time you return from the fields in your mind and settle fully into this place, the room feels smaller than it did at dawn. It is not only the walls, it is the number of lives pressed inside them, the number of needs that must fit into a few rough feet of space, and the number of comforts missing from every corner. You live in a building made for use, not care. Logs or boards form the walls, with gaps stuffed by mud, moss, scraps of cloth, or whatever can be found. In dry weather, the chinks crack. In wet weather, they swell and leak anyway. Rain taps through weak spots in the roof. Wind slips in through seams. In winter, cold settles low along the floor. In summer, the air grows thick and stale until the room feels like a held breath. The floor may be packed earth. Sometimes it is rough planks. Neither is kind to bare feet. Dust gathers in dry spells. Mud follows everyone inside after rain. A broom can sweep, but it cannot transform. You keep things as clean as possible because disorder invites insects, smell, and sickness. Yet the cabin always seems one hard day away from chaos. That is what happens when exhaustion is built into the architecture. The smell inside the quarters is never just one smell. Wood smoke clings to the walls and to every blanket. Damp clothing hangs with the scent of sweat, river water, and clay. Cornmeal cooks into a warm, plain smell that can feel comforting for a moment, until hunger reminds you how little there is. There may be onions, pork fat, beans, or greens if luck allows. There may also be sickness in the room, and sickness has its own heavy presence. Fever, old bandages and stale air, damp straw, and the sharp note of lye soap when someone has managed to wash. A typical cabin on a Mississippi plantation in 1850 is small enough that privacy becomes almost a fantasy. One room is common. 2 rooms, if they exist, may feel almost luxurious by comparison, which is an alarming sentence when you stop and think about it. Families divide space with blankets, habits, and silent agreements. Children sleep together. Adults make room where they can, a chest, a stool, a few pegs on the wall, a cooking pot, a gourd, maybe a skillet if fortune has smiled in a very limited way. Every object earns its place. You do not own much, but what is here matters deeply. A patched quilt, a wooden spoon worn smooth by use, a gourd dipper, a Bible page if one has somehow been kept, a small bundle wrapped in cloth, a headscarf folded carefully. These things are ordinary and precious at once. On a plantation, ordinary objects carry emotional weight because so little can be held securely. When the wider system tries to reduce life to labour, a spoon, a blanket, a button, a shell, or a scrap of fabric can become a tiny declaration that you still have a self. The fire is the centre of the room when there is fuel. You crouch near it for heat, for light, for cooking, and for the plain comfort of looking at something alive that is not a threat. Pine knots crackle. Smoke curls upward if the chimney draws properly. and sideways into your face if it does not. Eyes sting. Babies cough. Sparks pop onto the hearth. The touch of firelight on rough walls can make the cabin feel almost gentle for a breath or two. Then the draft creeps under the door and a reality clears its throat. Historians continue to debate how much control enslaved families had over the arrangement and upkeep of their cabins, because evidence varies by plantation and by season. Some testimonies suggest people improved their spaces whenever scraps of time and material allowed. Other accounts show quarters left dangerously neglected. Planters often describe the cabins as adequate, which is a useful reminder that powerful people have always had a talent for grading their own cruelty on a curve. You notice sound constantly in a place like this. Sound tells you who is near, who is sick, who is restless, who is trying to laugh, who is trying not to cry. There are footsteps outside in the yard, quiet talking through walls that are too thin to keep secrets. A pot lid rattles. Someone shakes a rag by the doorway. A child whimpers in sleep. An old board creaks when a person shifts their weight. Mules snort from a distance. Dogs bark near the big house or the barn. At times a fiddle can be heard somewhere among the cabins, a bright thread of sound moving through the dark like a stubborn refusal to surrender all joy. The yard outside the cabin is part of home too, though home here is a dangerous word, fragile and incomplete. You may see swept dirt, a few chickens if allowed, perhaps a little garden patch with greens, beans or sweet potatoes. Many enslaved families tried to cultivate tiny plots when time and plantation rules permitted. That small ground could mean flavour, medicine, better nourishment, or even a little chance to barter. A cabbage leaf, a mess of collards, a pepper plant, an onion bed. These could alter the texture of survival, not by much, enough to matter. A quirky detail that appears in some plantation accounts is the use of oyster shells, broken ceramics, bones, or shiny scraps as yard decorations around cabins, especially in parts of the South where people found ways to mark a space as cared for despite poverty and surveillance. It is a quiet kind of beauty, not decorative in the polite parlour sense, more like a whispered insistence that a place where people suffer can still bear signs of choice and memory. Inside, clothing hangs from pegs or lies folded in bundles. The cloth is rough, often made from cheap, coarse fabric issued by the plantation. It scratches the skin and stiffens when dirty. Women may receive dresses and head coverings. Men may get shirts and trousers. Children often wear simplified garments until older. Clothing wears out long before it is replaced, so patching becomes a regular skill. Elbows thin, knees split, hems fray. Needles matter. Thread matters. A scrap of decent cloth can feel like treasure. Laundry is no small task either. Water must be carried. Soap, if available. Maybe harsh homemade lye soap. Hands rub and wring. Cloth dries stiff in the air. The clean smell that comes after hard washing is brief but satisfying. One of the few moments when the body senses order rather than decay. Then the next day's labour arrives and the fabric begins collecting dirt again, because the plantation does not pause to admire your effort. Hunger moves through the cabin like another person. Some evenings it sits quietly. Some evenings it makes itself known in every mood and motion. Meals are often based on ration staples, cornmeal above all. Bacon or salt pork may add fat and flavour. Molasses may sweeten, if there is any. Greens from a patch, fish from a stream, berries gathered when possible, trapped game, or food secretly supplemented in other ways can ease the monotony. But monotony is the rule. The body craves variety because the body understands what it lacks even when no one says the words aloud. You watch how people stretch food with skill and patience. Cornmeal becomes mush, hoe cake, pone, or ash cake. Pork fat seasons beans. Greens are boiled down slowly. Sweet potatoes roast in embers. A little salt changes everything. A little onion can make a meal seem grander than it is. This is practical knowledge, but it is also cultural intelligence and passed hand to hand, bowl to bowl, generation to generation under terrible conditions. Children occupy the cabin in a way adults do not. They fill it with movement, complaint, curiosity, and sudden bursts of laughter. One moment they are playing with a rag doll, a carved stick, a hoop, or nothing at all but imagination. The next moment they are underfoot while cooking, crying from hunger, or sleeping in a tangle of limbs and breath. The sight of children in the quarters sharpens every reality at once. Their presence means love, burden, hope, danger, tenderness, and fear packed into the same small room. Disease is never far away. Cabins can be breeding places for coughs, fevers, and stomach illness because crowding, poor diet, insects, and overwork weaken everyone. In the Mississippi lowlands, malaria and other mosquito-borne sicknesses are constant threats. Dysentery can spread quickly. Respiratory sickness thrives in damp, smoky interiors. Medical care from plantation authorities is often careless, self-serving, or delayed. Enslaved people rely heavily on community knowledge, roots, poultices, teas, steam, and observation. A woman who knows which bark eases fever or which herb calms a stomach may become as valuable to the quarters as any official doctor, perhaps more so. There is tenderness here too. It would be false to leave that out. A mother smooths a child's hair with tired hands. A man repairs a stool after dark, though his shoulders ache. An older woman wraps a baby against the cold. Someone shares a bite of food they should probably keep. Someone sings while stirring a pot. Not because life is easy, but because silence would be heavier. Touch matters in such a place. A hand on a shoulder. A forehead checked for fever. A braid done carefully. A blanket tugged higher over sleeping feet. These are small acts, but small acts are the threads that keep a life from coming apart. And then there is fear. Fear comes in many forms inside the quarters. Fear of sale, fear of illness, fear of punishment reaching through the walls, fear that a child may be taken, fear that a spouse on another plantation may not be seen again, fear that a night knock at the door means trouble. You learn to hear danger in changes of tone outside, in unfamiliar footsteps, in the wrong horse arriving at the wrong hour. Some cabins hold family units recognized by custom, if not by law. Marriages among enslaved people are real and deeply meaningful, but they are not legally protected in the way white marriages are. The terrible fact haunts domestic life. Love exists under threat. Parents raise children while knowing the market may one day intervene. This uncertainty shapes even moments of peace. Happiness cannot fully relax because it knows how easily it can be broken. The quarters are also a place of talk once labour ends and the immediate tasks are handled. News moves from cabin to cabin. A birth, a death, a rumoured sale, a bit of plantation gossip, a detail overheard from white people that might matter later. Enslaved communities build knowledge networks because knowledge is protective. Who is in debt? Who has a temper? Who might hire out labour? Who is travelling? Which road patrol is active? Which dog is likely to bark? In a world designed to isolate and control, information becomes a form of shelter. Light fades quickly inside once evening settles. A candle, if available, is precious. More often, the fire provides most of what you see. Faces drift in and out of orange glow and shadow. Walls look softer in dimness. The room feels quieter, though never truly quiet. Crickets begin outside. Frogs answer from wet ground. The night air presses against the cabin as if listening. Some people speak softly of faith. Some pray openly. Some combine Christian language with older patterns of belief, memory, and symbolic meaning carried through generations and transformed on American soil. The spiritual life of the quarters is rich, layered, and not always easy for outsiders to understand. That is probably for the best. Not every truth should be easily available to the people who built the plantation order. The body now starts to insist on rest. Knees stiffen, hands throb. The back pulses with a dull ache that seems to have no exact location because it is everywhere. You lie down close to others, close enough to hear them breathe, and the darkness settles over the room. The pallet is thin. The blanket may be too light or too heavy for the season. Mosquitoes whine near your ear. Smoke lingers in your hair and clothes. Yet even here, in cramped space and tired silence, the cabin is more than a shelter assigned by the plantation. It is a place where people attempt the impossible every night. To turn endurance into routine, to turn scraps into a household, to turn a structure built by oppression into a lived human space. That effort is never complete, but it is real. And in the close, smoky dark, real is enough to keep going. By the time the sun lifts above the low trees, you're already in the cotton rows, and the field seems to spread wider each minute. It is one thing to look across a plantation from a distance and see neat lines fading into morning haze. It is another thing entirely to stand inside those lines, where every plant becomes a task and every task becomes hundreds more. The rows shape your movement, your posture, even your thoughts. They direct the eye forward and down, until the whole day begins to feel like a narrow corridor of leaves, stalks, dust, and command. The work changes with the season, because cotton is not just picked. It is planted, thinned, hoed, weeded, guarded, gathered, carried, weighed, and processed through a long cycle that controls the year. In spring, you may be dropping seed into furrows or covering it with careful strokes. Later comes chopping and thinning, where excess plants are cut away so the strongest can grow. Then comes the endless business of hoeing out weeds that steal moisture and light. By late summer and autumn, the bowls open and the picking begins in earnest. Each stage has its own strain, its own pace, and its own way of teaching the body that there is always more to do. A mainstream truth of plantation agriculture is simple and brutal. Cotton demanded relentless labour because planters measured success in output, and output depended on forcing as much work as possible from enslaved people. They tracked acreage, weight, and speed. You feel those numbers without ever seeing the account book, because the numbers become pressure on your hands, your spine, and your breath. When the day begins in the growing season, the plants may still be wet with dew. Your legs brush against damp leaves. Moisture soaks the hem of a dress or the lower edge of trousers. The air smells green at first, with the scent of crushed stems and soft earth opened by hoes. But as the sun rises higher, the smell shifts. Dust begins to rise from the dry parts of the field. Warm leaf scent mixes with sweat. Insect noise grows louder. By noon, the fresh softness of morning is gone, replaced by heat that presses on the skin like a heavy palm. Hooing is among the most monotonous forms of labour, and monotony can be its own punishment. You swing down, break the soil, cut weeds, step forward, and do it again. The movement repeats so often that the body tries to make it automatic, but pain keeps interrupting. Palms rub against wood, fingers tighten and loosen around the handle. Shoulders burn in a line that reaches up the neck. The lower back begins to ache with a slow, stubborn force. Feet sink slightly in the softer patches, then jar against hard clods. No part of the body remains uninvolved for long. You learn to read the field by touch almost as much as sight. A hoe biting cleanly into loose soil feels different from a blade catching a root. Cotton leaves brush the wrists in one way when the plants are young, and another when they are taller and fuller. Dry stems rasp against the skin. Burrs cling to fabric. During picking season, the open bowls have a deceptive softness. The cotton itself feels light and airy, but the burrs around it are sharp and can scrape fingers raw over the course of a day. By evening, fingertips may be sore, split, or bleeding lightly, especially when speed matters more than care. The rules also create a strange kind of isolation. Even with many people working together, each person is tied to a particular line of movement. You may hear others around you, but you still face your own stretch of labour. A voice rises briefly, a cough, a child calling from farther off, the creak of sack straps in harvest time, the soft thud of full cotton gathered and shifted. A horse snorts where the overseer waits. These sounds remind you that you are among people. Yet the field keeps each person locked into separate effort. There were different labour systems across the South, but on many Mississippi cotton plantations, gang labour shaped the day. Groups were organised under supervision, often with a driver or overseer monitoring pace. That system allowed planters to coordinate large numbers of workers across broad acreage, and it made the pressure collective. If one person slowed, it could draw notice. If the line moved unevenly, that too could bring trouble. The field becomes not only a workplace but a stage of constant comparison. Historians still disagree about how much flexibility existed in the daily pace on particular plantations, because records from owners often present an orderly picture that lived testimony complicates. Some planters described schedules as rational and humane. Formerly enslaved people remembered exhaustion, arbitrary demands, and targets that stretched with the owner's ambition. The truth likely varied in detail, but not in its central cruelty. The system was designed to extract labour, not to preserve health. Picking cotton in full season brings its own grim arithmetic. Each person carries a long sack, often dragging it behind through the rows. The bag begins nearly weightless, then grows heavier and heavier as the hours pass. The strap presses into the shoulder or across the chest. Dust clings to the fabric. Cotton catches on the edges. You reach, pull, drop, step. Reach, pull, drop, step. Over and over! The movement looks simple to anyone watching from a porch or horseback. Simplicity is misleading. Repetition at that scale changes the body. Hands cramp. Arms tingle. The neck stiffens from constant downward focus. The hips ache from carrying and turning. Each pound gathered is a small theft from muscle and breath. At weighing time, the numbers matter intensely. The daily total can affect punishment, praise, or comparison, though praise in such a system is rarely worth much. Some plantations set expected quotas, others judged by the season, the condition of the crop, or the overseer's temper. A strong picker might be admired as profitable, which is a terrible form of admiration. It means your skill increases someone else's power over you. Even competence becomes dangerous when it is owned by another person. A curious detail from plantation life is that some planters and agricultural reformers became obsessed with improving efficiency through tiny adjustments to spacing, seed selection, and cultivation techniques, as if the great mystery of cotton production were botanical rather than moral. They wrote about plant vigour, drainage, and field design with intense seriousness. Meanwhile, the true engine of the system was standing right in front of them, hungry and exhausted, and they chose not to see it as fully human. The blindness is almost impressive in its discipline. The weather shapes everything. Mississippi fields in summer can feel airless, especially in low, damp areas near bayous and sloughs. Heat rises from the ground as much as it falls from the sky. Shirts stick to the back. Cloth at the waist grows damp. Sweat runs into the eyes and leaves salt on the lips. Insects gather wherever moisture and skin meet. Mosquitoes are bad enough in early and late hours, but flies and gnats can plague the middle of the day too. You wave them off without pausing, because pausing is costly. Then there is mud. Not every day is dry and blistering. Rain can turn the field into a place of sucking clay and slippery footing. Shoes, if you have them, gather weight with each step. Bare feet slide and grip. The hem of a garment grows dark and soaked. Tools become harder to handle. The smell of wet earth is strong, rich, and almost pleasant for a fleeting instant, until the reality of labour drags it back into hardship. Cotton agriculture is often described in terms of sunlight and white fibre, but plantation work is just as often wet, sticky, and filthy. Children appear in these spaces too, though not always in the same tasks as adults. Younger children may pick up dropped cotton, carry water, or help in smaller ways. Older ones join more serious labour. You see them learning the field early, not through gentle instruction but through necessity. They learn where to step, how to keep moving, when to stay quiet, and how to read moods from a distance. The plantation educates efficiently and cruelly. It teaches obedience, endurance, and watchfulness long before it should teach anything at all. Women in the cotton rows endure the same field demands as men in many cases, while also carrying burdens that planters often ignored or exploited. Pregnant women might still be driven into labour. Mothers with infants faced impossible choices and impossible expectations. The body was never allowed to be simply a body. It was always treated as a unit of production, whether aching, recovering, carrying a child, or weakened by lack of food. That disregard sits at the heart of the plantation order, yet within the field, people still create forms of communication that survive supervision. A glance can warn, a phrase can carry layered meaning. Songs may sometimes be used to steady rhythm, pass time, or share feeling, though not every plantation allowed much sound. Some spirituals and work songs held double meanings, and scholars continue to explore how much coded communication they carried in different settings. It's one of those historical questions that resists neat answers. Evidence exists, but the inner intention of a singer is not always recoverable. What is clear is that music, when it appeared, could hold grief, endurance, wit, and communal feeling all at once. The afternoon often feels longest in the rows. Morning has movement and coolness, however brief. Evening offers the promise of release, however limited. Afternoon gives you neither, it just lingers. The light becomes hard and almost metallic. The field seems to vibrate in the heat. Cotton leaves cast small, sharp shadows. The mind narrows to immediate tasks because thinking too far ahead only makes the hours heavier. Step, reach, cut, pull, carry. The verbs become the whole world. Sometimes there is a brief interruption. A tool breaks. A child stumbles. A cloud passes over the sun, and everyone feels the change on their skin at once. A distant rumble suggests rain. A hawk circles overhead. Tiny things become noticeable because they break repetition. Even the smell of crushed mint underfoot near a damp edge of field can feel strangely vivid, as if the senses are trying to rescue a scrap of life from uniformity. By late day, the body begins to lose precision. Arms are slower to lift, hands fumble more often. The row ahead seems to stretch rather than shrink. Dust settles into every fold of cloth. Cotton lint clings to sleeves. The taste in your mouth is part salt, part dryness, part plain fatigue. You no longer feel each separate discomfort because they have merged into one larger condition. Tiredness becomes the atmosphere inside your skin. The field is also a place where humiliation can be staged publicly. Falling behind, dropping cotton, missing weeds, or showing visible fatigue can draw rebuke or worse. That threat keeps people moving, even when the body wants to stop. Plantation discipline often relied on spectacle as much as pain. It needed everyone to see what happened when an owner or overseer decided the pace was not enough. The rows may look quiet from afar, but inside them sits a constant emotional strain, and still, work gets done. That is one of the harshest truths. The field does not merely symbolize exploitation, it produces results. Cotton leaves the plantation, moves to gins, presses, boats, markets, mills and ports, and from there into a vast Atlantic economy. The softness of finished cotton cloth in distant shops begins here in heat, dust, and coercion. A person elsewhere may touch a smooth garment and never imagine the scraped fingers and bent backs folded into its making. As the sun lowers, the light softens, but the labour does not immediately ease. One more row, then another, one more sack to fill, one more pass with the hoe. The end is never announced with drama. It arrives when authority decides enough has been taken for the day. Until then, the field keeps asking. You stand in the fading light among the cotton plants and feel how completely the workday has occupied the body. Your hands carry the memory of every stalk. Your shoulders remember every lift. Your feet know the rows, even when your eyes blur with sweat and dust. The field has pressed itself into you, not as an image, but as an ache. And tomorrow, it will ask again. You feel him before you look at him. That is how power works on a plantation. It enters the body as tension before it becomes a face, a voice, or a command. Somewhere behind you there is the creak of leather, the shift of a saddle, the clipped rhythm of horse hooves on packed ground, or the sound of boots through dry stalks. Your shoulders tighten, your hands keep moving, your ears begin measuring distance without permission. In Mississippi, cotton country in 1850, surveillance is not occasional, it is part of the weather. The overseer stands between the planter's ambitions and the labour of the field. He is hired to increase output, maintain order, and report results. Which sounds tidy enough on paper. In practice, it means he's paid to turn human strain into profit. He watches pace, posture, tool use, speech, and mood. He notices who slows, who straightens too often, who glances aside, who looks ill, who dares appear distracted. Some overseers are remembered as brutal and explosive. Others are described as cold, measured, and efficient. The difference matters in daily feeling, but not in moral substance. The task itself is violent even when the voice stays calm. You learn quickly that discipline on a plantation is not only about punishment after the fact. It is about making people expect punishment before anything happens. That expectation does a great deal of the work. The body senses itself. You move faster when footsteps draw near. You lower your gaze. You swallow words. You save your honest face for moments of privacy. Because an expression can be read as insolence if the wrong person needs an excuse. A mainstream fact of plantation management is that enslaved labour on large cotton estates was often organised through layers of supervision. The planter might not stand in the field all day, but his authority travelled through overseers, drivers, bookkeepers, and trusted intermediaries. On some plantations, enslaved drivers were forced into painful positions, expected to push others while remaining trapped within the same system. That structure helped the plantation function across wide acreage, and it spread fear through every part of the workday. The sound of authority is memorable. It may be a short order delivered without wasted words. It may be a sharp call across the rows. It may be the simple silence of someone watching from horseback. Even silence becomes active when it is attached to power. You can feel it prickling at the back of your neck. A person who controls punishment does not always need to raise his voice. The possibility is enough. The plantation also runs on records, ledgers, tally books, crop notes, inventories, lists of names, lists of ages, lists of values. A person can be reduced to a line of ink by someone sitting in shade with a pen. That is one of the colder facts of slavery. Violence is physical, but it is also administrative. Numbers help make cruelty look orderly. A child becomes part of an estate valuation. A woman becomes a labour unit with reproductive value. A skilled man becomes a higher figure on a sale list. The paper stays clean while life grows ragged. You do not see every ledger, of course, but you feel their consequences. A good crop year may harden expectations for the next year. A debt may increase pressure. A planter boasting to neighbours about production may bring tighter supervision to the fields. The mathematics of cotton enters your life as longer hours, harsher demands, and thinner patience from men whose fortunes rise and fall with market prices they barely control. It is a grim comedy in its way. Powerful people gambling with land and credit, then taking their panic out on those they own. Historians still debate the exact balance of authority between planter, overseer, and driver on many individual plantations, because surviving records are patchy and often self-serving. Some planters like to imagine themselves as humane patriarchs while blaming harshness on overseers. Some overseers blamed planters for impossible demands. Formerly enslaved people remembered the system as a whole, not as a tidy chart of responsibilities, and that broader memory is often the more truthful one. The pain did not arrive labelled by office. When punishment does come, it is meant to do more than correct a single act. It is meant to instruct everyone watching. That is why discipline is often public. An accusation of laziness, insolence, truancy, theft, or resistance can become a performance of power. The plantation wants obedience to spread through observation. It wants fear to travel faster than any one blow. Even when a person escapes immediate punishment, the sight or sound of someone else suffering can haunt the body for days. There is also the constant possibility of arbitrary enforcement. Rules may be spoken clearly one day and ignored the next. A person may be rebuked for talking, then ordered to answer a question. One overseer may care obsessively about neat rows. Another may fixate on picking weight. One may punish lateness. Another may punish the tone of a reply. Unpredictability is useful to a coercive system because it keeps everyone off balance. You cannot fully prepare for a standard that shifts with temper. A curious detail from plantation correspondence is how often white managers describe themselves as burdened professionals, as if the true hardship in Mississippi were the inconvenience of supervising forced labour under the hot sun. They complained about unreliable workers, poor discipline, weather delays, and planter demands with a tone of weary martyrdom that would be almost funny if it were not attached to so much suffering. The overseer could imagine himself the put-upon party while standing at the centre of other people's exhaustion. Human self-pity is remarkably flexible. The planter himself may appear less often in the field, but his presence still shapes everything. Some owners inspect the work personally, riding out in decent clothes, speaking in clipped evaluations, glancing over rows as if viewing machinery. Others prefer reports and intervene mainly when displeased. A few cultivate an image of paternal benevolence, asking questions in a tone meant to sound kind. Yet the underlying fact remains. Every cabin, every field, every ration, every separation of family has his consent behind it. Even the softer voice belongs to the same structure. Touch becomes part of the discipline too, not only in direct violence but in constant bodily regulation. You stand straighter when watched. You grip the hoe differently. You quicken your hand in the sack. Your muscles respond to another man's mood. It is a strange theft. He does not merely take labour. He reaches into posture, tempo, breathing, and nerves. The body becomes a surface on which authority writes itself all day long. The atmosphere changes whenever a horse enters the rows. Dust lifts around hooves. Leather creaks. The animal's smell joins the smell of cotton, sweat, and dirt. Some people keep their eyes down. Others glance up only briefly. A horse gives height and speed to supervision. It lets a man survey more ground and appear suddenly where he was not expected. That mobility matters. So does the symbolism. One person elevated and armed. Many others bent to the work. Enslaved people did not simply submit inwardly to all this, even when outward compliance was necessary. Resentment, judgment, memory, and moral clarity persisted under the surface. A person might obey an order while privately despising the man who gave it. That inner divide matters. Slavery sought not only labour but domination of the spirit, and it never fully achieved that second goal. The overseer could command motion. He could not command genuine respect. You notice how information about those in power circulates among the enslaved. which overseer drinks, which one startles easily, which planter is in debt, which son is eager to prove himself, which patrol rides late on Saturdays, which man can be distracted by flattery. This is practical intelligence, gathered for survival. It does not remove danger, but it helps people navigate it. On plantations, character study is not a hobby, it is defensive equipment. There are also negotiations too small for official records, a request for extra time from a pregnant woman, a plea for medicine, an excuse offered for a broken tool, a quiet attempt to protect a child from the harshest task. These moments can matter enormously in daily life, yet they unfold inside a huge imbalance of power. A concession granted today may be withdrawn tomorrow. Mercy, where it appears, is unstable because it depends on whim rather than justice. The language of plantation authority is often deeply revealing. White men in power spoke of discipline, management, efficiency, and order. They called adults boys and girls. They praised obedience as if it were virtue rather than coercion. They described resistance as disorder, laziness, or ingratitude, carefully avoiding the obvious possibility that any person might naturally resist being owned. Euphemisms served the system well. It turned theft into property rights and cruelty into correction. At times, religion was folded into supervision too. Some planters and ministers urged obedience through selective biblical teaching, presenting submission as godly and hierarchy as natural. Yet enslaved people frequently heard and reshaped religious messages through their own experience, finding in Scripture not only commands to endure but promises of justice, deliverance, and moral reversal. The same Bible could move through the plantation and come alive in very different hands. The mental load of surveillance is exhausting in ways that are easy to miss from a distance. It is tiring to be watched. It is tiring to monitor your own face. It is tiring to calculate risk with every word. By mid-afternoon, the sun may be hammering the rose, but the emotional strain of being measured can feel just as heavy. Even a person doing everything possible to comply may remain tense, because compliance offers no guarantee of safety. In some places, bells, horns, and clocks supported this discipline by dividing the day into audible commands. Time itself became external, imposed, and supervised. You did not simply work until tired. You worked until told to stop. That distinction matters. The plantation wanted control over the boundary between labour and rest, hunger and food, night and sleep. To own a person was to claim authority over time as much as over body. By late day, tempers could sharpen across the whole system. An overseer sweating through his shirt might grow more irritable. A planter dissatisfied with numbers might ride out to inspect. Workers nearing collapse might struggle to hide fatigue. In that atmosphere, one small incident could ripple outward. A dropped sack, a broken harness strap, a misunderstood reply. The plantation order liked to pretend it was stable and rational. In truth, it rested on unstable emotions managed through force, and yet the people in the rows saw clearly. They knew who lied, they knew who exaggerated, they knew which white men were brave only when armed or backed by law. They knew that much of plantation authority depended on custom, violence, and performance, rather than true moral legitimacy. That knowledge could not always be spoken aloud, but it lived in looks, jokes, stories, warnings, and private judgment. As evening approaches, supervision does not disappear. It travels with you into the yard, the ration line, the quarters, the pass system, the patrol roads, the rules about movement and gathering. The field may be the most visible stage of surveillance, but it is not the only one. Plantation life is built from repeated intrusions into ordinary human acts, working, resting, loving, speaking, walking, parenting, grieving. All of it lies under someone else's claim. That is what makes the overseer's shadow so large. It is not only the man himself, It is the whole structure condensed into one daily presence. A horse in the row, a voice in the heat, a ledger waiting somewhere in the shade. A system always asking the same question in different forms. Are you under control yet? By the time evening settles over the plantation, hunger has become a steady companion, not loud anymore, just firm and patient. It sits behind the ribs and follows every movement. You feel it while crouching near the fire, while lifting a pot, while waiting for a cake of cornmeal to harden enough to eat. Hunger on a Mississippi cotton plantation in 1850 is rarely dramatic in the storybook sense. It is not always a theatrical empty table or a single desperate cry. More often it is ordinary, repeated and built into the structure of life. It appears in thin wrists, tired eyes, short tempers, slow healing cuts, and the way people watch food with serious attention. The plantation provides rations because labour must be sustained, but the goal is not health. The goal is continued work at the lowest possible cost. That distinction shapes everything you eat. On many plantations, weekly rations for enslaved people include cornmeal and pork, sometimes with molasses, peas, or sweet potatoes depending on the owner, quitas, season, and local custom. The quantities vary. The quality varies too. Salt pork may be rancid. Cornmeal may be coarse and stale. Supplies may be delayed, cut, or stretched. A person can survive on such food for a time. Thriving is another matter entirely. A mainstream fact of slavery is that plantation rations were often monotonous and nutritionally inadequate, especially when measured against the physical demands placed on field workers. Hard labour in heat burns enormous energy. A diet dominated by cornmeal and pork can fill the stomach for a few hours, yet still leave the body undernourished. The result is visible in worn muscles, swollen bellies in children, weakness during illness, and the constant need to supplement food whenever possible. You stand near the hearth and watch simple ingredients become supper, cornmeal mixed with water and perhaps a little salt, hoe cake slapped onto a hot surface, ash cake tucked into coals, mush stirred in a pot until it thickens. If there is bacon grease, the smell grows richer at once, smoky and almost luxurious. If there are greens from a patch, the steam carries a deeper earth scent. If someone has managed to get onions, their sharp sweetness transforms the room. Small changes in food can feel grand because the baseline is so plain. The smell of cooking does not erase fatigue, but it softens the edge of the day. Wood smoke curls through the cabin. Hot iron clicks as it heats and cools. A spoon scrapes the pot. A child asks when the food will be ready. Someone says soon, though soon is a flexible promise. The first bite of warm cornbread can be satisfying. Rough on the tongue yet comforting in the stomach. Then the body remembers how hungry it really is, and the portion seems to shrink. Many enslaved people worked hard to improve their food supply through gardens, fishing, trapping, hunting, gathering wild plants, or raising small livestock when allowed. These efforts were not hobbies. They were survival strategies. A patch of collards, turnips, beans, or sweet potatoes could make the difference between a meal that merely filled the stomach and one that nourished it. Fish from a stream, berries from a hedge, persimmons in season, wild greens, pecans, or game caught quietly could add flavour and strength. The landscape became a storehouse that had to be read carefully. A curious detail from plantation life is how skilled many enslaved cooks became at transforming the plainest ingredients into food with variety and character. Cornmeal alone could appear in several forms. Greens could be seasoned to produce deep flavour, even with a little meat. Molasses could make a scrap of cake seem festive. Some dishes later celebrated as Southern comfort food were shaped in large part by black culinary knowledge developed under coercion, scarcity, and ingenuity. The injustice sits inside the flavour if you know how to taste history. Historians still debate how much access enslaved people had to independent food production on particular plantations. because the answer depended on land, region, owner policy, and time of year. Some owners allowed garden plots and informal marketing, others restricted them sharply. Testimony from formerly enslaved people often shows that any extra food came through hard work squeezed into hours that should have been used for rest. What appears in plantation records as a privilege often felt in lived experience like a second shift. Clothing tells a similar story of calculation and neglect. Plantation owners generally issued garments according to age, sex, and season, but the clothing was cheap, coarse, and limited. Fabric could be heavy home-spun wool and cotton blend for winter. Lighter Osnaburg or similar rough cloth for warmer months. With simple cuts meant to cover the body and endure wear, men might receive shirts, trousers, and perhaps a jacket. Women might receive dresses, shifts, and head coverings. Children often got even less: shoes, blankets, and hats might be issued once a year, or not adequately replaced when worn out. The touch of this clothing stays with you all day. Rough cloth rubs the neck and underarms. Seams chafe at the shoulder. Wet fabric clings after rain or sweat and then dries stiff against the skin. Bare feet toughen if shoes are lacking, but toughened does not mean protected. Stubble, splinters, stones, thorns, hot dirt, winter mud, all of it leaves its mark. A shoe with a split sole may be almost worse than none at all, flapping and letting grit gather inside. Yet even poor shoes are repaired repeatedly because materials are scarce and every scrap matters. You see how carefully people guard cloth. Old garments become patches for newer ones. A worn dress is cut down for a child. A shirt too torn for field use becomes rags, wrappings, or quilt pieces. Needles are precious. Thread is precious. Hands mending by firelight after a full workday reveal the hidden labour of staying covered. The plantation counted issued clothing as provision. The people wearing it knew better. Provision was only the beginning. Survival required sewing, saving, altering, tying, pinning, and making do until the fabric itself nearly gave up from exhaustion. Blankets mattered as much as clothes, especially in cooler weather. Mississippi is known for heat, and rightly so, but winter cold and damp could bite hard in cabins with poor insulation. A thin blanket on a pallet over rough boards or packed earth did not keep out drafts. Children curled together for warmth. Adults slept in layers if they had them. The smell of blankets held smoke, old wool, sweat, and weather. Comfort was limited, but warmth could still feel like a blessing. Laundry added another burden. Clothes did not clean themselves simply because people desperately wanted them to. Water had to be hauled. Soap, often harsh lye soap, had to be made or obtained. Garments had to be scrubbed, rinsed, wrung, and hung. Knuckles cracked from the work. Hands reddened. Fabric stiffened as it dried. Clean clothing could lift a person's spirits for an hour, but plantation life quickly ground that freshness back into dust and sweat. The labour of washing fell especially heavily on women and girls, who often carried domestic responsibilities on top of field work. Children reveal the material hardships of plantation life with painful clarity. A child in an oversized shirt, bare legs dusty, hair uncombed because no one had the energy that morning, tells you almost everything about scarcity at a glance. Some children wore little in warm weather beyond a long shirt or simple shift until older. Cold weather exposed the limits of plantation care. When clothes were too thin or too late, children suffered first and visibly. Their bodies did not have reserves to spare. The body itself becomes part of the record of deprivation. Skin dries and cracks. Insects bite and leave angry welts. Sun burns the neck and forearms. Feet toughen, blister, heal, and blister again. A cut from a cotton burr or a tool handle may linger because diet and fatigue slow recovery. Teeth ache, eyes tire. A cough hangs on longer than it should. Underfed bodies must still meet the demands of the field. and the field is not interested in excuses produced by reality. There were moments, though, when care appeared through material things: a woman tying a cleaner headcloth before worship, a man polishing his shoes as best he can on a rare, quieter evening, a mother saving the least worn garment for a child on a special day, a bright scrap of ribbon acquired somehow and treasured beyond its monetary worth. These acts were not vanity, they were dignity made visible. On a plantation, self-presentation could become a quiet statement that you were still a person, and not merely an assigned function. Some enslaved people also participated in small informal economies. They sold eggs, vegetables, baskets, fish, or crafted goods when permitted, or exchanged items within the quarters. Money was scarce, opportunity uneven, and danger always present. Yet such exchanges could provide cloth, tobacco, pins, combs, or better food. The existence of these small economies reminds you that plantation life was not a sealed box. It contained negotiation, skill, and resourcefulness, even under brutal constraint. Smell often marks the boundary between bare survival and brief comfort. The smell of a pot with real seasoning, the clean sharpness of soap on washed cloth, the faint sweetness of molasses, fresh cut onions, roasting sweet potatoes, sun-dried blankets, pine smoke on cool air. These sensory details matter because they break the dullness of scarcity. They tell the body, for a moment, that life contains something besides endurance. The psychological weight of material lack should not be underestimated. It is tiring to think constantly about whether there is enough meal left for tomorrow, whether a shoe will last another week, whether a child has outgrown a garment, whether a blanket can survive one more winter. Poverty and slavery was not accidental. It was part of the mechanism. Keeping people dependent and undersupplied made control easier. Yet that same poverty demanded planning, skill, and domestic intelligence from the people forced to live within it. You see this intelligence in the smallest gestures: grease saved in a cup for later cooking, cloth folded away from sparks, a cracked pot balanced carefully so it can serve one more season, greens planted where the soil holds moisture, food hidden from rats, needles wrapped safely, shoes dried by the fire but not too close, children taught not to waste crumbs. None of this appears grand. All of it is expertise. By night, when the meal is eaten and the fire burns lower, the cabin smells of smoke, damp cloth, and tired bodies. A child licks the last trace of molasses from a finger. Someone folds a garment for mourning. Someone else rubs sore feet and studies a split seam that will need attention. The world of cotton wealth is far away from this room. Though it was built from people like these, here the truth is plain. Bare survival is work. Eating is work. Staying clothed is work. Keeping warm is work. Every necessity has to be pulled, stretched, repaired, and defended. The miracle is not that these conditions existed. Human cruelty has arranged such things too often. The miracle is how much life people still made inside them. Before the sky even begins to pale, you can sense how much of plantation life rests on the labour of women. Not because anyone in power admits it plainly. Of course. Plantation records tend to flatten women into numbers, field hands, breeding capacity, domestic usefulness, or household property. Cold words. Efficient words. Yet when you step into the real texture of a Mississippi plantation in 1850, you see that black women are expected to carry work in nearly every direction at once. They labour in the fields, they labour in the cabins, they labour through pregnancy, illness, grief, and fear, and somehow, against every effort to crush them, they also keep carrying knowledge, care, memory, and community. A mainstream fact of slavery in the Cotton South is that many enslaved black women performed hard agricultural labour alongside men, especially on large plantations focused on cotton production. Popular imagery has often tried to soften this truth, as if women were mostly sheltered in kitchens or nurseries, Some women were assigned domestic work. Yes, but vast numbers spent long days in the rows, hoeing, planting, weeding, picking, hauling, and enduring the same punishing heat and surveillance. The field did not make generous allowances for womanhood. It barely acknowledged it at all. You watch a woman step into the morning with a child still half asleep inside the cabin, and the first thing you notice is pace. She moves with urgency even before the day properly begins. Fire to stir, food to stretch, water to carry, a small face to wipe, a garment to tie, a baby to settle with an older child or another woman if that can be arranged. Then the field calls, as if all that earlier effort did not count as labour. That is the bitter trick. The day includes work before the official work even starts. The touch of these mornings is rough and immediate. Coarse cloth at the shoulders, damp ground underfoot, a cooking pot hot at the handle, the heavy feeling in the arms from yesterday not yet gone, the child clinging for one more second. The air cooled for a brief moment, then turning warm and sticky as the sun rises. None of it is gentle. Yet women learn to move through it with practiced economy, making impossible schedules look almost ordinary. Almost. The body still knows the price. Pregnancy does not remove a woman from exploitation. On many plantations, pregnant women were expected to continue labour for as long as possible, with only uneven and limited concessions depending on the owner, overseer, stage of pregnancy, and immediate demands of the crop. That fact is as cruel as it sounds. You can imagine the weight of the child, the ache in the lower back, the swelling feet, the dizziness in the heat, and still the rows stretch ahead. The plantation does not see vulnerability. It sees diminished output and tries to manage it. Historians still argue over the exact extent of work modifications given to pregnant women on different plantations, because evidence varies widely and owners often exaggerated their own kindness. Some accounts mention lighter duties late in pregnancy. Others describe women working almost until childbirth. What remains consistent is the underlying principle. Relief, when offered, was conditional and pragmatic, not humane in the full sense. A system built on ownership does not suddenly become tender because it notices a mother carrying a child. You also see how gender shapes danger. Enslaved black women lived under the threat of sexual coercion and assault from white men who held legal and social power over them. This danger is central to plantation life, even when records try to look away. It affects how women move, whom they avoid, how they interpret a summons, how they weigh silence and speech, how they think about their children, and how they understand the bodies forced to labour for others. The violation may be hidden, denied, joked about by the powerful, or folded into the normal business of the plantation, which only deepens the horror. A grimly revealing detail of the era is that enslaved women could be valued in part for their ability to bear children, since children born to enslaved mothers inherited enslaved status. Think about the moral coldness required to turn motherhood into asset growth. Planters did it with astonishing composure. They could discuss fertility in business terms while presenting themselves as respectable Christians. Human beings have a talent for contradiction when money is involved, but the burden is not only bodily, it is emotional too, and constant. Women are often expected to steady frightened children, soothe the sick, mend clothing, prepare food, and preserve some sense of family continuity in a world determined to fracture it. You see a woman who has spent all day in the field return to a cabin and begin another shift without ceremony. Meal to cook, baby to nurse, child to scold gently, cloth to wash, elder to help, a wound to examine, cornmeal to measure. Nothing in the plantation clock records this second labour, yet the night is full of it. The sounds around women at day's end carry this double burden clearly. A pot scraped clean, water sloshing in a bucket, a child whining from hunger, quiet singing meant to calm, Needles pulling thread through cloth, someone coughing in the corner, frogs outside in the wet ground or crickets near the doorway. The sounds of work do not stop when the field empties. They simply change instruments. Some women are assigned to the big house or surrounding domestic spaces, and these positions bring their own heavy strains. Cooking, washing, cleaning, nursing white children, sewing, carrying trays, tending fires, answering bells, moving silently through rooms built to display wealth. To outsiders, domestic work might appear less punishing than field labour. Sometimes it spared the body the worst sun, but it often demanded unbroken availability, careful emotional control, and close contact with white households where privacy disappeared almost entirely. A woman in domestic service could be under constant scrutiny and at heightened risk of exploitation. Different labour, not easier labour in any simple sense. The smell of domestic work clings differently than the smell of the field. Ashen soap, boiled starch, almond linen, yeast bread, meat roasting in a kitchen where you prepare food you may barely taste, wax, polish, lamp oil, wet laundry and hot irons. These smells belong to labour just as much as cotton dust and sun-scorched leaves do. They tell you where the body has been used. Another scholarly question remains difficult to measure with precision. How much authority did enslaved women exercise within the quarters, especially older women, healers, midwives, cooks, and mothers whose knowledge made daily life possible? The answer varies by plantation and by personality, but many testimonies suggest that women carried immense informal influence. They knew remedies, family lines, birth practices, songs, food ways, and community histories. They could not escape the system through that knowledge alone, yet the system depended on them while refusing to honour what they held. Midwives deserve special attention. On plantations. Childbirth often depended less on formal white medicine than on the experience of black women who had delivered many babies and knew the rhythms of labour, comfort, position, herbs, and practical care. Their hands brought children into a dangerous world with skill that rarely appears in official praise. A woman might spend the day bent in the rows and still be called at night to help another through childbirth. Imagine the stamina. Imagine the steadiness required. Imagine doing it all while living under the same threat as everyone else in the room. Women also carried culture through the smallest repeated acts: hair braiding, naming, storytelling, cooking, spiritual guidance, lullabies, gesture, the tying of headcloths, the teaching of children when to speak softly and when to stay still. These things may seem minor beside the drama of labour and punishment, but they are part of how a people remain a people under assault. Oppression tries to make life flat and mechanical. Women, again and again, made it relational. Children often read the world first through women's labour. They feel the hand that wakes them, washes them, feeds them if food is there, or shields them with a tired body when danger approaches. They hear warnings in a mother's voice that contain more than words. They watch girls learn tasks early, not because anyone thinks this ideal, but because need has no patience. A daughter may fetch water, mind younger children, stir the pot, sweep the yard, spin, sew, or carry messages long before she's tall enough to do any of it comfortably. The cruelty of family separation weighed especially hard on women. Sale could tear apart marriages, siblings, and children with almost no recourse. A mother lived with the knowledge that affection itself could become a future source of pain if a child were sold away. That uncertainty shaped daily love without eliminating it. In fact, it often intensified it. To love under slavery was to love with alertness, with protectiveness, with fear braided into tenderness. The emotional labour of that cannot be measured in any ledger, even in the field. Women developed strategies of endurance. Some paced themselves with hidden skill. Some exchanged help in brief, quiet ways. Some carried humour sharp enough to cut through fatigue. Gentle sarcasm had its uses. A raised eyebrow could say what a sentence could not. A muttered remark shared at the right moment could keep despair from taking centre stage. Laughter on a plantation was never proof of contentment. More often, it was proof that the spirit had not surrendered. Touch remains at the centre of this world, rough hands braiding hair, fingers testing a child's forehead for fever, palms kneading cornmeal dough, arms lifting wet laundry, shoulders straining under sacks. A baby asleep against a chest, still damp from the field. The same body that is exploited all day becomes, by night, the body that comforts others. That contrast is one of the clearest truths of women's lives under slavery. They were forced to give and give, even when little was left. There were women who resisted openly and women who resisted quietly. Some argued, some ran, some slowed work, hid food, preserved forbidden relationships, passed information, protected children, feigned illness, or refused emotional obedience even when compelled to perform practical obedience. Resistance wore many forms, and women practiced them in ways the official record often failed to understand. A planter might see only disobedience or inefficiency. The community might see courage, grief, or care. As night settles over the quarters, the final image is not one of passivity. It is one of continuation under pressure. A woman bends over a pot, then over a child, then over a torn seam, then over her own exhausted knees for one brief moment of silence. Firelight catches the side of her face. Smoke lifts slowly toward the roof. Outside, the plantation grows dim, but her labour still shapes the lives around her. That is the double burden, though double hardly covers it. Field and cabin, body and heart, production and protection, endurance and tenderness. And somehow, still, she rises again. Childhood on a Mississippi cotton plantation in 1850 does not disappear completely, but it is pressed, bent, and shortened until it fits the needs of the estate. You see it in the morning yard, where a small child still chases a chicken with total seriousness, then moments later is told to fetch water, mind a baby, or carry something heavier than seems fair for such thin arms. That is the pattern. Play flickers. Duty closes over it. The plantation does not wait for children to become ready. It simply begins using them as soon as it can. A mainstream fact of slavery is that enslaved children were gradually drawn into labour from a young age, often beginning with tasks considered light by adults and moving into harder work as they grew. The word light deserves suspicion here. Carrying water, gathering chips for the fire, fanning flies away from a baby, scaring birds from fields, or picking up dropped cotton might sound minor in a ledger. To a child, under heat, hunger, and fear, it is work all the same. Teach us early that time does not belong to you. You notice first how children learn by watching. They study faces before they study tools. They know which adult voice means safety, which means urgency, which means silence now. They learn the sound of an overseer's horse before they can explain who he is. They understand that some roads are dangerous and some doors are risky and some questions should be swallowed. This is education by atmosphere. The plantation teaches caution long before it teaches skill. The quarters hold many of the first lessons. A girl may be shown how to sweep a dirt yard smooth with a brush broom, how to stir meal without wasting it, how to keep sparks from catching cloth, how to hold a baby on one hip while using the other hand for work. A boy may be taught to bring wood, carry a pail without sloshing too much, watch an animal's mood, or run a message without repeating what he has heard. These are practical lessons, but they're also lessons in obedience, timing, and endurance. The children absorb them because everyone around them is busy surviving. The sound of childhood is still there if you listen carefully. Quick laughter, bare feet slapping hard earth, pebbles clattering in a game. A whisper turned into a dare, a sudden cry from a scraped knee, the soft hum of the tune repeated without thinking. Yet these sounds sit beside other sounds that should not belong to childhood at all. A tired sigh from a child carrying a bucket, a serious voice soothing a younger sibling, the dry cough of poor diet and smoky air. Silence when an adult with power comes near. Historians still debate how much time enslaved children had for play in different places and at different ages, because memory and record often catch extremes more readily than the ordinary middle. Some former slaves remembered games, songs, and makeshift toys with vivid warmth. Others emphasise labour so early and so heavy that play barely registers. Both can be true. Childhood under slavery was not one thing. It depended on age, owner, crop demands, family structure, and luck, though luck was rarely generous for long. A curious detail from the period is the inventiveness of children's toys. With little or nothing provided, children used corn cobs, carved sticks, strings, hoops, bones, scraps of cloth, shells, and bits of wood to make play where they could. A rag doll with stitched eyes, a wheel rolled with a stick, pebbles sorted into games with complicated rules. Tiny objects held enormous value because they were not just toys. They were proof that imagination had not been fully starved. You can almost feel the texture of these handmade things, a corncob dried and light in the hand, a doll sewn from rough cloth with stuffing that shifts inside, smooth stones warmed by the sun, a stick polished by repeated gripping. Small things, yes. But childhood often survives in small things. By the age of 6 or 7, many children are already expected to contribute in visible ways. They might watch younger children while adults work. They might gather kindling, carry food to the fields, or bring water where needed. Slightly older children may drive birds away from newly planted crops or pick worms from leaves. These tasks are folded into daily life so naturally that adults may stop naming them as work. Yet the children know. Their feet grow tired, their arms ache, their attention is demanded when it would rather wander. Once children reach 10, 11, or 12, expectations can harden sharply. On cotton plantations, older children are often pushed toward regular field labour, especially at planting, hoeing, and picking thyme. A child too small for a full sack may begin with a shorter one. Hands learn the burrs, the neck learns the downward angle, the back begins its apprenticeship in pain. There is no ceremony for this change, no speech. One season. A child is hovering at the edge of the field. Then the field closes around them. Mothers and older women often try to soften this passage where they can. A hand adjusting a shoulder cloth, advice on how to pace yourself, a warning about where to step after rain, a bit of food saved for later, a quiet instruction on how to keep an eye on the overseer's movements without seeming to look. This is education too, and often more important than anything written in a book. It is knowledge for getting through the day intact. Books themselves occupy a painful place in this world. Literacy among enslaved people was feared by many slaveholders, and access to reading and writing was often restricted or outright forbidden. That did not prevent all learning, but it made learning dangerous. Some children heard Bible passages, letters, or scraps of print and became curious. Some were secretly taught by free black people, sympathetic whites, or other enslaved people who had learned. Some studied signs, labels, or marks wherever they could. Even the wish to read could feel like stepping toward forbidden ground. You sense how quickly children become emotionally observant. They can tell when the adults are speaking in regular tones, and when they are speaking around fear. They notice which names are said softly. They notice when someone has been crying and pretends not to have been crying. They recognize tension before a possible sale, sickness, or punishment, even if no one explains it directly. In many families, children are protected from the worst knowledge only partially. The plantation has too many ways of making itself obvious. The smell of children's lives is mixed with the whole plantation atmosphere. Smoke in the hair, dirt on the legs, sweetness from roasted potato if there has been any, sour milk breath from an infant, river water, sun-warmed cloth, pine resin on the fingers from gathered wood. Sweat from running, playing, working, or all three in the same hour. Childhood here is never separate from labour. The body carries both. There were also ceremonies of growth, though not always formal ones. Hair braided differently. A longer garment issued. A child trusted with a sharper tool. A new task given without explanation. A place on the edge of adult conversation. These moments marked movement toward greater responsibility, though not toward freedom. In many cultures, growing up comes with pride. On a plantation, growth often means being noticed by the labour system as newly useful. That is a hard way to be seen. The danger of sale hangs over childhood with special cruelty. Children can be sold with parents, away from parents, or inherited into new circumstances through estate division. A child may not fully understand the market logic, but the fear of separation can still live in the body. It shows in clinging hands, in panic when an unfamiliar white man appears, in the intensity with which a child memorizes a mother's voice or a father's face. Love becomes urgent when the world keeps hinting it may be temporary. Some older children learn skills beyond field work. Boys may be trained around animals, tools, carts, or simple trades if a planter sees advantage. Girls may learn spinning, sewing, dairying, cooking, or nursing work at increasing levels of responsibility. Skilled labour could bring slightly different conditions, but not real safety. Utility to the plantation could protect a child from one hardship only to expose them to another. The system's gift for rearranging pain should never be underestimated. Yet children are not only shaped by the plantation, they shape one another. Older siblings teach younger ones games, songs, nicknames, and survival habits. They invent worlds in the dust. They tell stories half remembered from elders and half made up on the spot. They laugh at absurd things because laughter is available even in hard places. Gentle sarcasm shows up early too. A child can roll the eyes with such art that no words are needed. Oppression hates wit because wit suggests a mind that will not lie flat. Scholars continue to argue about the emotional worlds of enslaved children because adult records often misread them. White observers frequently saw silence as contentment or cheerfulness as proof of harmless dependence. They missed the possibility that children could be alert, strategic, grieving, and adaptive all at once. A child might play in the yard one minute and fall into fear the next. A child might love deeply and mistrust deeply. Human complexity does not wait for adulthood. When evening comes, children settle into the quarters with varying degrees of resistance. Some drop into sleep almost mid-sentence, too tired to finish chewing. Some become suddenly lively, released for an hour from direct work. Some cry from hunger, heat, or plain exhaustion. The room fills with little sounds, hiccups after crying, murmured comfort, a half-whispered story, the tap of small fingers on a bowl, the rustle of straw or blanket. Adults continue working around them, but children still alter the emotional centre of the room simply by being there. It is important not to imagine these children only as symbols of suffering. They were that. Yes, but never only that. They were observant, stubborn, affectionate, inventive, annoying, funny, curious, jealous, brave, and frightened in endlessly changing combinations. A child could misbehave, sulk, boast, tell secrets, show off, hide, sing, pout, or daydream on a plantation just as elsewhere. That ordinary humanity matters. Slavery tried to classify children as future labour or present property. Their actual lives overflowed those categories at every turn. As night deepens, a child curls against a mother, an older sister, a grandmother, or a brother barely old enough to carry such responsibility. The day has taught its harsh lessons again. Carry this, watch that, stay quiet, work now, do not wander. But another set of lessons survives alongside them. Hold on, share food, remember names, listen carefully, laugh when you can, sleep while the room is warm, and in that narrow space between burden and belonging, childhood keeps flickering. Night comes slowly to a Mississippi plantation, as if the day is reluctant to loosen its grip. The last light lingers in the dust above the yards, then fades into a softer blue over the trees and the low wet ground. By this hour, bodies are worn down to their simplest needs. Food, water, a place to sit, a place to breathe without command hanging over every movement. Yet this is also when another kind of life begins to gather itself. Not freedom, not safety, not anything so generous, but a pocket of human time, shaped by voices, memory, and the stubborn wish to be more than the day's labour. You step into the quarters after dark and hear the plantation change its tune. The field noises are gone. In their place come smaller sounds, closer sounds. Firewood settling in a hearth, a spoon against a bowl, someone humming low, a baby fussing and then quieting against a shoulder, crickets outside in the grass, frogs calling from some damp ditch or pond, feet moving carefully through the yard, laughter breaking out for a second and then dropping back down, as if joy itself knows to stay alert. A mainstream fact of enslaved life is that evenings and Sundays often became precious spaces for community, worship, courtship, storytelling, music, and the maintenance of family ties, even under constant surveillance and exhaustion. This does not mean people were suddenly free when the sun went down. Far from it. But within the limits forced upon them, many enslaved black Americans created rich social and spiritual lives that the plantation system could not fully erase. The first thing you notice is posture. In the field, bodies bend to the crop. Here, if only for a little while, they lean toward one another instead. A woman sits with her elbows on her knees and lets out a breath she has held all day. A man stretches sore fingers toward the fire. Children drift closer to adults, drowsy but listening. Faces softened by firelight look different from faces in full sun. Less guarded, sometimes, more tired, certainly, yet also more fully themselves. The smell of the quarters at night is thick and layered. Smoke hangs low in some cabins, cornbread crumbs, pork fat, greens, soap, sweat, damp wool, river mud still drying on hems, maybe a hint of tobacco, maybe a little sweetness if molasses has been shared. These are not polished domestic scents, they are rough, lived-in, honest smells. They tell you that people have eaten, washed what they could, settled children, and tried to reclaim a few feet of ground from the demands of the plantation. Spiritual life moves quietly through this atmosphere. Prayer may happen in full voice or in a near whisper. Some families bow their heads around the fire. Some gather in cabins with trusted friends. Some slip away to brush arbours, ravines, woods, or hidden clearings when they believe they can avoid white supervision. These meetings, often called hush harbours in later memory, became places where religion could be spoken in tones not approved by owners. There, spiritual language could carry sorrow, hope, warning, and a longing for justice that was far larger than the plantation wanted to hear. Historians still debate how common secret nighttime worship was on every plantation, because evidence varies and memory can blend different times and places. Some owners tolerated controlled religious meetings, others feared unsupervised gatherings and tried to prevent them. What seems certain is that enslaved people often reshaped Christianity in ways that emphasized deliverance, endurance, divine judgment, and the dignity of the oppressed. The same scripture used by white preachers to demand obedience could be heard very differently in the quarters. You hear it in the singing, not always loud, not always formal, sometimes just a line begun by one person and joined by another, sometimes a spiritual carried slowly, with long notes that seem to hold more feeling than words can manage. Sometimes a rhythm tapped gently by hand or foot. Music works in several directions at once. It soothes children. It eases the mind after a brutal day. It lets grief move without breaking the speaker open. It creates company where loneliness threatens to spread. A quirky detail of plantation nightlife is how often music relied on whatever was available. Hands, feet, a stick on a floorboard, a gourd instrument, a banjo fashioned through black musical traditions, a fiddle in skilled hands if one could be had. The sound did not need polished refinement to matter. In fact, its roughness could be part of its beauty. A bent note in a smoky cabin may have carried more truth than a polished performance in a grand parlour ever could. Storytelling also fills the night. You sit near the fire and hear tales told with a dry wit that survives hardship remarkably well. Animal stories with sly meanings, family recollections, warnings dressed as jokes, bits of local news passed with care. A tale may sound simple on the surface while teaching children whom not to trust, how to judge character, or how to see pride brought low. Trickster figures often thrive in such worlds because tricksters understand what direct power does not. They know that weakness can outthink strength when it must. Children listen hardest when they pretend not to be listening. A small face goes still, eyes grow wide in the orange light, a hand pauses halfway to the mouth. Stories are entertainment, yes, but they are also education. They teach memory, they teach timing, they teach language with rhythm and force, they teach that intelligence may wear a humble face, and that the mighty can be ridiculous. Under slavery, that is a useful lesson to absorb early. There is courtship here too, though shaped by uncertainty. A young man may stand near a doorway and speak softly to a woman, while trying not to draw unwanted notice. A glance across the yard can carry more feeling than a long speech. Time together is limited. Distance between plantations may complicate everything. Marriage has no secure legal protection for the enslaved. Yet emotional bonds are real and deeply important. People still choose, hope, flirt, argue, promise, and dream in ways that the law does not honour but cannot prevent from existing. Touch changes meaning at night. During the day, touch is often about labour, control, burden, or pain. At night it can become comfort again. A hand rubbing a sore shoulder, a child's hair being braided slowly, a blanket drawn over sleeping feet, two adults sitting close enough that their knees touch in the dimness, an elder pressing a palm to a forehead to check for fever. These gestures look small from outside. Inside the life of the quarters, they are precious. You also notice the role of elders. Older men and women may no longer move as quickly in the field, or may have different tasks. But at night their authority can become clearer. They remember names, kin ties, births, losses, songs, remedies, and stories carried across years of upheaval. They help settle disputes. They interpret behaviour. They decide when a joke has gone too far. They keep community memory alive in a world built on forced forgetting. The night is not free from fear. That must be said plainly. Patrols can ride. Overseers can intrude. Unexpected footsteps can tighten every muscle in the room. Rules about movement and gathering remain in force. People lower voices when they must. Someone posted near a doorway may listen for danger while others sing or pray. Even joy has to keep one ear open. That tension shapes the atmosphere constantly. Yet the fact that people gather anyway tells you how necessary these moments are. Some evenings are too exhausting for much conversation. A person may sit in silence or staring at the fire, hearing others but barely able to answer. Exhaustion itself becomes a presence in the room, heavy and dull. Still, even silent company matters. To sit near others after a day of command and strain is its own relief. No performance, no measured output, just breathing in the same space. There were also nights when hidden information moved through the quarters. Word of a possible sale, news from a nearby plantation, rumours about politics or war far beyond Mississippi, directions to a relative, whispered mention of a person who had run and not yet been caught. Such information travelled unevenly, but it mattered immensely. Community was not only emotional support, it was also a network of knowledge, caution, and practical survival. Scholars continue to discuss how much African cultural practice remained visible in the religious and social life of enslaved communities by 1850 Mississippi. The answer is complex. Direct continuities can be hard to trace neatly, especially after generations of forced displacement and adaptation. Yet patterns in music, movement, call and response, spiritual intensity, naming, foodways, healing practices, and communal values suggest that African inheritance did not vanish. They changed, mixed, survived, and found new forms on American soil. You can sense that layered inheritance in the cadence of voices, in the ring of clapped rhythm, in the seriousness of naming kin, in the care given to burial and prayer, in the way sorrow and praise are allowed to stand close together without cancelling each other. Plantation owners could regulate hours and rations. They could not fully govern how meaning was made among the people they enslaved. Outside, the night air cools a little. The smell of wet ground rises stronger now that the heat has broken. Stars appear above the dark line of trees. Somewhere a dog barks and then stops. In one cabin, a song tapers into silence. In another, someone tells a joke that draws a tired laugh. In another, prayer continues in a low murmur. The quarters are never grand, never easy, never safe enough, but they are alive with more than suffering. That is the important truth of the night. As people begin to lie down, the atmosphere softens further. Children drift into sleep mid-story. Adults speak more slowly. Firelight drops lower. The day's hardness has not vanished. It lingers in sore backs and worried minds. Yet around those aches gathers something durable. Fellowship, faith, shared language, shared memory. The plain comfort of being recognised by the people beside you. The plantation wanted labour units. Night, even in scraps, restored persons. Resistance on a cotton plantation rarely looks dramatic at first glance. It does not always arrive with a shout, a chase, or a bold break into the night. More often, it lives in small emotions that the plantation system tries not to notice or cannot fully understand. A slowed hand, a hidden tool, a warning passed in time, a private refusal to let the master's opinion become your own. In Mississippi in 1850, where the workday seems built to crush initiative, resistance often survives by becoming quiet, patient, and difficult to measure. A mainstream fact of slavery is that enslaved people resisted constantly, in ways both open and concealed. Some ran away, some fought back, some sabotaged tools, feigned illness, stole food, preserved forbidden relationships, or learned to appear obedient while withholding trust and inner consent. Plantation records often emphasize the most visible acts, because those were easier to punish and easier to write down. Daily resistance, the sort woven into ordinary life, was harder to track. It left fewer clean marks on paper, though it shaped the atmosphere of slavery all the same. You feel the logic of quiet resistance in the field itself. Every demand for speed creates a temptation to calculate where speed can be stolen back. A person may work, but not with the full efficiency the overseer imagines he owns. A row may be completed, but not with cheerful cooperation. A tool may be used until it conveniently fails. None of this destroys the plantation. That is true. But it interrupts the fantasy of complete control, and that matters. The body becomes one site of this struggle. On paper, the enslaved person is property. In practice, the body remains partly its own because pain, illness, fatigue, and will do not obey market logic. A person can claim sickness when possible, exaggerate weakness, limp a little more than usual, or move with careful slowness that stays just inside the boundary of what can be punished. Such acts require judgment. Too much and suspicion rises, too little and nothing is gained. Resistance often depended on timing as much as courage. Historians still debate how often enslaved people used work slowdowns, tool breaking, and feigned illness in particular settings, because masters and overseers interpreted events through self-serving assumptions. A broken hoe might reflect sabotage, neglect, bad material, or plain bad luck. A headache might be a tactic, a real headache, or both. The uncertainty itself is revealing. Life under slavery produced grey areas where intention could not always be pinned down, and many enslaved people made practical use of that ambiguity. You notice how intelligence becomes part of survival. People study the plantation closely. They learn which rules are rigid and which are inconsistently enforced. They learn when an overseer is distracted, when a planter is away, when patrols grow lax, when weather offers cover, when a dog is more bark than bite. This constant reading of people and conditions turns the enslaved into some of the sharpest observers on the plantation. They have to be. Their lives depend on understanding a world designed against them. A curious detail from slaveholding correspondence is how often owners complained that enslaved workers were sly, deceitful, lazy, or impossible to manage perfectly. These complaints reveal more than their authors intended. They show that domination was never seamless. The masters wanted total obedience and could not get it. Instead, they faced people who adapted, concealed, negotiated, and outthought them in 100 daily ways. The language of white frustration is often accidental evidence of black resourcefulness. Food is one common field of resistance. Taking extra food from a smokehouse, garden, kitchen, or field could be framed by owners as theft. But from the perspective of the enslaved, it often meant survival, justice, or both. The plantation claimed ownership over bodies and then underfed them. That contradiction made the moral situation plain. Taking what you needed from an unjust master was not the same as stealing from an equal neighbour. Many enslaved people understood that perfectly well. The same goes for movement. Leaving the plantation without permission was a punishable offence. Yet people still visited spouses, children, siblings, and parents on nearby estates whenever the chance appeared. These journeys could be brief and dangerous, taken at night or on limited free hours, but they reveal a deeper truth. Family ties were stronger than plantation boundaries whenever people could make them so. To walk miles in darkness just to see a loved one for a few hours was resistance to the owner's claim that he controlled your relationships as fully as he controlled your labour. Some resistance was more direct. Running away remained a constant fear for slaveholders, even when successful long-distance escape from Mississippi was incredibly difficult. Swamps, dogs, patrols, rivers, distance, and unfamiliar roads made every mile dangerous. Yet people still ran. Some aimed for free states, some hid nearby for days or weeks, some sought family, some fled punishment, some simply reached a point where staying felt unbearable. Not every escape succeeded. Many did not. The decision itself, though, exposed the lie that slavery could ever secure willing obedience. There were also acts of verbal resistance, a sharp reply, a refusal to flatter, a truth spoken in anger. Such acts could bring severe punishment, which is why silence often seemed wiser. But when words broke through, they mattered. They reminded everyone present that the enslaved could judge the system morally, even if they could not overthrow it in that moment. The master preferred obedience that looked natural. Defiant words shattered that illusion. The quarters held another type of resistance too. Memory, naming kin, teaching children where they came from, passing along stories, songs, recipes, burial customs, herbal knowledge, courtship habits, and spiritual interpretations. These are not always recognized as resistance because they do not disrupt work directly, yet they oppose one of slavery's central ambitions, which is to reduce people to useful bodies detached from inherited meaning. Every preserved tradition, however altered by American conditions, challenged that flattening. Women often carry this cultural resistance in especially vital ways, through child rearing, food preparation, healing knowledge, hair care, storytelling, and community ties. They transmitted forms of selfhood the plantation did not create and could not fully erase. Men did this too through labour skill and music, kinship, teaching, and practical protection. Resistance was communal work even when particular acts looked individual. Religion could also become oppositional, even when expressed softly. White ministers might preach obedience, but enslaved people heard other themes in Scripture: deliverance from bondage, judgment on the mighty, the dignity of the lowly, the value of suffering seen by God, prayer meetings, spirituals, and hush gatherings sometimes held a quiet political force precisely because they insisted on a moral universe bigger than the plantation. To believe the master was not the final authority in existence was already a dangerous thought. Scholars continue to discuss how often poisonings, arson, or more aggressive sabotage occurred in places like Mississippi, because evidence is clouded by rumour, fear, and the exaggerations of slaveholders who often imagined plots everywhere. Some incidents certainly happened. Others were likely inventions or misunderstandings. What matters here is not sensational mystery, but proportion. Most resistance was probably less spectacular and more constant than planter nightmares suggested. It lived in the daily friction between domination and the human refusal to become fully compliant. Humour belongs in this story too, not because life was funny in any broad sense, but because wit could puncture pretension. Enslaved people often mocked white people in private, imitating their voices, exposing their vanity, or laughing at their contradictions. A master could own land, horses, and people and still be ridiculous. In fact, power often makes people ridiculous. Quiet mockery gave emotional distance from those who demanded reverence. It kept moral scales from tipping too far in the master's favour. Skilled labour offered another opening. Blacksmiths, carpenters, drivers, cooks, mill workers, and others sometimes had slightly greater mobility or access to information. Skill did not equal freedom, but it could create bargaining space or opportunities to help others. A blacksmith might understand tools and timing in useful ways. A cook might move near the big house and overhear plans. A driver might soften a demand when possible. None of these positions were simple. They came with compromises and dangers. Still, they remind you that plantation life contained many zones where control was contested, rather than absolute. Touch, smell, and sound all carried the traces of quiet resistance. A hidden packet of food tucked into cloth, the faint scent of fish caught after dark, the sound of footsteps moving off the road to avoid patrols, a whispered warning through a cabin wall, a tool handle loosened just enough to frustrate a day's work, a child being taught a family name not found in any ledger. Resistance was material. It lived in objects, roots, habits, and tones of voice. Some people resisted mainly by staying emotionally alive. That may sound small, but under slavery it was not. To love deeply, to grieve honestly, to hope, to judge, to pray, to imagine a different future. All of this stood against the plantation's attempt to define reality completely. There is a reason tyrannies fear inner life. Inner life can become the first territory that refuses surrender. By night, these hidden efforts settle into the quarters like embers. No grand speech announces them. They are carried in tired hands, wary eyes, careful planning, and private conversation. Someone has saved a little food. Someone has passed along a warning. Someone has chosen not to repeat the master's insult at home. Someone has taught a child how to remember. Someone has endured the day without granting the overseer the last word inside the mind. That is what resistance often looked like on a Mississippi cotton plantation. Not always thunder, often friction, often cunning, often moral refusal disguised as routine. And in a world built on forced labour, even friction could be a form of power. When you live inside an endless workday, time changes its nature. It no longer feels like a river moving towards somewhere new. It feels more like a wheel turning over the same ground, wearing deep grooves into body and mind. On a Mississippi cotton plantation in 1850, the repetition is one of the great injuries. Wake in darkness, work in heat, return in fatigue, sleep in fragments, rise and do it again. The body learns the rhythm because it must, but learning does not make it lighter. It only makes the burden more familiar. A mainstream fact of plantation slavery is that the system depended not merely on occasional hard labour, but on the steady, repeated extraction of labour over years, decades, and lifetimes. That repetition built fortunes. It cleared land, raised cotton, fed markets, and helped finance a vast economy stretching far beyond Mississippi. The wealth was real, so was the suffering. One did not exist without the other, however politely later generations tried to separate them. You can feel the long strain most clearly in the body of an older field worker, hands thickened and scarred, shoulders rounded from years of bending, knees stiff in the cool morning, eyes narrowed by sun glare and distance, skin marked by weather, insects, and labour. Strength may still remain, but it has been harvested repeatedly, like the crop itself. The plantation takes not only each day, but the accumulated force of thousands of days. That is what makes the phrase endless workdays so exact. The work is not only long, it is cumulative. Morning on such a plantation does not arrive innocently. Even before the first sound outside the cabin, the body often wakes in anticipation. A dull ache in the back, fingers reluctant to close, calves tight from yesterday, the smell of old smoke and damp fabric, a child stirring beside you. The darkness before dawn feels less like rest and more like a short pause. In an argument you are destined to lose again by sunrise. This is not laziness. It is bodily knowledge. Historians still argue over how enslaved people themselves measured time emotionally under slavery, because records rarely preserve inner feeling with neat clarity. Planters wrote about seasons, tasks, and profits. Formerly enslaved people, speaking later, often described memory in sensory fragments, moments of fear, acts of love, punishments, songs, separations, and ordinary routines that stretched across years. That pattern tells you something important. Life under slavery was not experienced as an abstract institution. It was lived through repeated days, each one concrete, physical, and full of human detail. A peculiar feature of plantation life is how much of it depended on pretending repetition was natural. Owners like to present the order of the estate as fixed, sensible, and even benevolent. The horn sounds, the hands go out, the crop grows, the work gets done. Yet the more you look, the less natural it appears. Every part of the routine requires force, surveillance, threat, or deprivation to maintain it. Without coercion, the whole performance collapses. Routine begins to look less like order and more like pressure held in place. You see this clearly in the emotional lives of the enslaved. People did not become machines simply because the day repeated. They still feared sale. They still mourned the dead. They still felt anger, tenderness, jealousy, desire, boredom, and hope. They still noticed weather, smelled rain before it came, laughed at someone's sharp joke, worried over a sick child, listened for distant hooves at night, and treasured rare moments of peace. The plantation could standardize labour, but it could not fully standardize feeling. That human variation is one reason the system had to keep tightening its grip. The seasons changed the look of the fields, but they did not bring true relief. Spring brought planting, then chopping and hoeing. Summer thickened the air and lengthened the strain. Autumn brought picking and weighing. Winter shortened the light but not the demands of repair, hauling, ditching, cutting wood and maintaining the estate. Even the calendar offered no real escape. The task shifted shape, that was all. Endless workdays were not confined to one harvest rush. They were the structure of the year. There is also the matter of uncertainty, which adds another layer to repetition. A person might survive the routine for years and still never know when a sale, death, whipping, sickness, debt crisis, or estate division would tear life open. That uncertainty sharpened the texture of ordinary days. A meal in the cabin could be peaceful and anxious at once. A song could hold comfort and grief in the same breath. Love itself became more intense because nothing felt securely guaranteed. A revealing detail from the broader cotton economy is how often white Americans in the period admired plantation prosperity, without wanting to look closely at the daily labour behind it. They praised fine cotton, rich soil, expanding markets, handsome houses, and river trade. They discussed output as if it emerged from climate and enterprise alone. This selective vision was one of slavery's great accomplices. It allowed people far from the field to enjoy the results, while treating the labouring lives at the centre as scenery or silence. But silence was never the whole truth. The quarters spoke. The field spoke. Bodies spoke through their injuries. Families spoke through their attempts to stay together. Spiritual spoke. Gardens spoke. Secret visits to loved ones spoke. Quiet resistance spoke. Skilled hands repairing a broken thing after dark spoke. A mother teaching a child a name worth remembering spoke. The history of Mississippi plantations is not only the history of oppression, it is also the history of people continuously answering oppression with life. That life had texture. You smell it in wood smoke clinging to blankets, in pork fat sizzling in a pan, in the river scent rising from low ground after sunset, in crushed cotton leaves and hot dust in the rows, in clean soap on a shirt scrubbed with effort. You hear it in frogs near the ditches, in the scrape of a hoe, in a baby settling after tears, in a low prayer spoken by the fire, in a laugh that slips out despite everything. You feel it in rough cloth, aching shoulders, warm hands braiding hair, a child's head resting against an arm gone tired from labour. History is often told in laws and dates. Life was lived in touch, smell, and sound. And what of dignity? That word matters here. Dignity on a plantation did not come from the system. The system denied it at every turn. Dignity came from the people enduring within the system without accepting its moral judgment on their worth. It lived in the refusal to become what the master imagined. It lived in care for family, in skilled work done for one's own people, in humour, in worship, in mourning, in naming injustice even when only in whispers. A person could be denied rights, wages, safety, and rest and still remain fully human. In fact, the human insistence on remaining human is one of the strongest currents running through this history. By late evening, after the food is eaten and the last tasks are done, the plantation grows quieter. The sky darkens over the cabins and the barns. The big house stands at a distance, self-satisfied in the dim light, as if architecture could prove innocence. It cannot. The truth lies elsewhere, in the worn threshold of the cabin, in the patched garment folded for mourning, in the tired body lowering itself to rest, knowing the horn will sound again. This is what life was actually like for black Americans on cotton plantations in Mississippi in 1850. Not romance, not paternal gentleness, not some soft faded picture of moonlight and magnolias. It was labour pushed past fairness into theft. It was hunger managed just enough to preserve output. It was family life built under threat, It was womanhood burdened in every direction. It was childhood interrupted. It was surveillance, uncertainty, and fear as daily conditions. But it was also endurance of astonishing depth, skill, belief, love, memory, wit, community, dignity that survived without permission. And now, as the night deepens, the pace begins to soften. The fire burns lower and lower, until it is more glow than flame. Outside, the wet Mississippi ground releases the last warmth of the day, and the air turns gentler on the skin. The cabins settle into stillness. A murmur fades. A child sighs in sleep. Crickets keep up their careful music in the dark grass, and somewhere beyond the quarters, frogs answer from quiet water. You let the images drift more slowly now. The rows of cotton no longer blaze beneath the noon sun. They stand in shadow, silvered faintly by moonlight. The tools are set down. The sacks are empty. The voices of command have fallen silent for a few tender hours. What remains is the softer truth of human presence. A blanket pulled up. A hand resting over another hand. The slow breath of people who have carried too much and still kept something inwardly their own. The night does not erase hardship. It only wraps it in darkness and gives the spirit a little room to loosen. The smoke scent thins. The stars hold steady above the flat land. The river moves somewhere beyond sight, patient and unseen, and you rest there for a moment, in that dim and fragile quiet, where sorrow and endurance both grow hushed, and the long day finally lets go. End of script. Sleep well.